And we'll just let people, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give people a few minutes to join, make sure they can connect all right. As we get going, I'm welcome from a rather windy, well, it was very wet. The sun's come out, a rather windy and very wet Norfolk. And we are hoping to have a fair few people on the call. Today, we just got one speaker, Laura Dawkins from the Met Office. Laura is a climate risk and resilience expert scientist at the Met Office and an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Bristol School of Mathematics. At the Met Office, Laura is leading the development of an innovative climate risk framework that is actively informing government policy on climate resilience. And we probably need a lot more of that. She works in close partnership with stakeholders across diverse sectors, applying advanced statistical and data science modelling techniques to help organisations better understand and manage impacts of weather and climate on their infrastructure and operations. So today's very apt because we've got yellow weather warnings everywhere, strong winds, I think getting up to 70 mile an hour here, and about 50 mil of rain in Norfolk, which is about 7.5% of the annual total. So hopefully people's travel isn't too much disrupted, leaves on the line, but to be fair, the trees may still be attached this time. So if we jump onto the next slide, we've got Laura's presentation, that'll be followed by a Q&A. Please post questions in the Q&A box above, not in the chat box. All attendees will remain muted unless they wish to speak later on. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared on the Met Office Science and Services YouTube channel. If you have any technical difficulty, please don't ask me. Use the ukcp user network at the Met Office below. Also, very importantly, I'm fully independent of the Met Office, fully independent of UK government. And if I do say anything, it will be only from my perspective and not from anything to do with UK government or MI5 or MI6 or anything like that before they start knocking on the door. So yes, so oh yeah, and I'll mention this again at the end, but please, if there's a lot of people on the mailing list, many hundreds, over 100 people have registered for this event today. Please, if you wish to present anything, please do get in touch with us. It's a good platform to talk about what you're doing, how you're using UKCP data, any issues, any you're having, anything more that you want to know, anything you want to share, your experiences, really valuable platform. So please do contact us. That'll be very useful in the future. So I will now pass over to Laura. And there's our Q&A, so we'll finish about 12:35. And I'll let Laura take control and start her presentation. So thank you very much, everyone.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, my name is Laura Dawkins, and I work at the Met Office in the climate resilience team. And today I'm going to talk about this really long title of integrating UKCP with spatial risk frameworks to inform government policy on climate resilience. And this is work that I've done with a number of colleagues. I've just listed some of their names there, so big thank you to all of them. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the kind of first half of that title. So integrating UK climate projections with spatial risk frameworks. So how have we done that? So first of all, what is a spatial risk framework? So these sort of originate from catastrophe modelling in the reinsurance sector, and they're a tool for kind of spatially consistent event-based quantitative risk estimation. So this is a kind of schematic that shows that process. So you kind of have event generation. So you have an event set of hazard events that you're interested in, say windstorms, thinking about the weather today. And you then kind of find the local intensity of that event or each of those events where you're interested, and combine that with exposure data that you have. In the insurance context, this may be a number of kind of properties that are being insured, and kind of the value of those, and then that's combined with information about how kind of vulnerable that building is to estimate the damage from each of those events. And then that's combined with maybe policy information, financial information to quantify the insured loss for those events. So this is very much a financial example, and what we wanted to do was kind of broaden the context of that to not just look at financial risk, but kind of wider climate risks. And it's this kind of classic Venn diagram of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability combining to quantify risk, which is this sort of classic Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition. And there are tools out there for implementing this sort of framework. One of the key ones, and the one that we use throughout this piece of work, is known as Climada. And this has been developed by researchers at ETH Zurich, so a university in Zurich. And as I've been saying, this is this combination of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and it provides this really useful software and code to do that in a kind of event-based way. And there are a number of other open source platforms as well that do very similar things: Riskscape, Climax, and the Oasis loss modeling framework. And we explored some of these as well, but predominantly in this talk, I'll talk about Climada. So how did we integrate UKCP with these risk frameworks? So this piece of work was under research under the UK Climate Resilience Programme. This is a big programme of work, lasted for about 4 years, involving lots of universities and the Met Office. And the aim of this specific piece of work within this programme was to develop the capability to use multiple climate data sources within an open source quantitative risk assessment framework. And in particular, although we did explore other platforms and other climate data, I'll particularly talk about how we integrate UK climate projections with Climada as the risk framework. And the overall aim was to kind of support the UK climate change risk assessment, or CCRA, identified need for more spatial granularity in our national risk assessments so that we can really inform local adaptation. So there's this need for this real kind of spatial quantification of risk. And basically, how can we explore the application of these classically kind of insurance-based models to climate timescales and climate projections? So to demonstrate how we integrated UKCP with this spatial risk framework, I'm going to just base this on an idealized application that we used throughout the kind of papers that we have on how we did this. So the risk that we specifically kind of quantified in this idealized application was the expected annual total number of days of physical work lost due to heat stress. So if you think about people working outdoors, how will the temperature impact their capability to work, and therefore how will they lose hours and days of work due to that extreme heat and how that stresses their body? So the hazard information that we used was a metric known as humidex, and critically, we take this from the UK climate projections. In this case, we applied a bias correction and we used the regional climate model with 12 ensemble members. And here we just have a plot of what humidex is. So it's basically a combination of temperature and relative humidity. And this plot on the left here is showing how they combine to calculate humidex. And then on the right, we just have a map of this humidex hazard metric for a particular event, a particular day in the climate projections. And as I said, we use the regional climate projections, which produce a number of ensemble members, which help us to quantify parameter uncertainty in the climate model. And then specifically in this application, we use 3 global warming levels to try and capture different kind of potential climate scenarios. So we used 20-year time slices to represent 3 different scenarios: the current climate, or kind of recent past, and then 2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial and 4 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial. And the way that we found this time slice was to, for each ensemble member, find where the global average temperature crosses each of these global warming thresholds, and then take a time slice around that year. And then each day in the time slice is considered to be an event, which we're then trying to characterize how that event impacts on physical work and heat stress, and how physical work may be lost due to heat stress. So then in terms of the vulnerability part of that Venn diagram, what we need is a function that maps our hazard, so the humidex intensity in this case, to the impact, which in this case is the kind of the percentage reduction in your capacity for physical work. And for this, in this idealized application, we used a function taken from a paper in the literature. And this basically relates those two things, and they did kind of experiments to explore how humidity and temperature impact on physical capabilities to kind of exercise. And in this simplistic application, we use the same function to represent everybody. But obviously, if you're going to apply this in a real world application, you'd want to vary that by demographic and potentially region as well. Then in terms of exposure, we want to quantify the number of people working in outdoor physical jobs across the country. And we wanted to not only capture this now, but also in the future. So we used UK socioeconomic pathways to do that. And from that data, you can extract the number of people working in outdoor physical jobs from kind of now into the end of the century as a projection. And those projections are based on 5 different socioeconomic futures, where they have different kind of levels of challenge around adaptation and mitigation. We did explore a number of these in our work, but we particularly, in this case, I'm going to demonstrate the use of SSP2, or this middle of the road example. So then on a particular day, in a particular event, for example, thinking about the event here in plot B, we can calculate the severity of that event by taking the intensity of the hazard, so the humidex, applying the vulnerability function to capture the kind of impact that heat would have, that humidex would have on any given person at that location, and then we just multiply it by the number of people at that location to get a kind of impact on that particular event. And then the risk is just some kind of statistic of all of that information. So for example, in this case, we're showing a map here of the expected annual impact. So if you accrue the impact across a whole year and then take the average over the years that we have the data for, then we have this sort of expected annual impact. And here this map is presented for one ensemble member from the regional climate projections, for the 2-degree global warming level, and as I said, SSP2. And so this is a kind of quantification of the impact that heat might have on physical work in the UK in the future. And we kind of I've plotted, kind of shown this in a schematic here that kind of shows the end-to-end framework. So as I've just demonstrated, we input spatially consistent hazard exposure and vulnerability information. These provide us with hazard maps, exposure maps, and a vulnerability function. These are all combined within the Climada risk assessment platform, and that platform basically allows us to do that kind of severity and that risk calculation at each location that we're interested in. And then as an additional part of the work, I developed a data science model that allows us to stochastically simulate additional ensemble members in terms of the risk, so that we can better quantify ensemble uncertainty. And I won't go into lots of detail about that here, but we have papers on that if you're interested in that part of it. And then we also wanted to explore the uncertainty and sensitivity of risk to those different modelers' choices. So there's a number of subjective choices you have to make about how you set up your risk assessment, how you calibrate the data, which data source you use, which future, which warming level, which SSP, and how you set the parameters of the vulnerability function. And we kind of varied all of those and explored which the risk was most sensitive to, which helps us to kind of target our future research to try and reduce that uncertainty or understand it better. So we have a couple of papers on this work. So yeah, very much encourage you to have a look at those if you're interested to find out more. So then how is this informing government policy on climate resilience? So in particular, we've been working with the Department for Education and the Ministry of Justice in this work, which has been really great to work with them. So just to put a bit of background in terms of the context of what the government needs to do around climate adaptation and climate risk. So the Climate Change Risk Assessment, or CCRA, is a statutory requirement under the Climate Change Act from 2008, and it's published every 5 years and identifies the kind of key risks and opportunities posed by climate change in the UK. And it's produced by a consortium of expert authors from academia and industry. And then the Climate Change Committee, or CCC, provides sort of statutory advice and lead an independent assessment of UK climate risk. And then in response to this, government departments then write the National Adaptation Programme, or NAP, which sets out the UK government's response to the risks identified in the CCRA. And it's again published every 5 years, aligning with the CCRA cycle. And this is very much action orientated. So it details how the government and stakeholders will adapt to climate impacts. And there's a biannual monitoring of this from the Climate Change Committee. And this is just a timeline of that kind of process. So the first CCRA was published in 2012, and then there were kind of NAP and CCRA, and then so the most recent CCRA is CCRA 3, published in 2022. We're currently in the NAP 3 phase, and then CCRA 4 will be published in 2027. And so in the third climate change risk assessment published in 2022, there was a particular risk, H13, that was identified that related the risk of delivering education and prison services from extreme weather. So this is obviously relevant for the Department for Education and Ministry of Justice. And this outlines some beneficial actions in the next 5 years, one of which includes a site risk assessments and adaptation plans. So we're kind of hoping we can help to inform that using our kind of risk assessment tool. And so in the NAP 3 that was published in 2023, there was more, the Ministry of Justice and the Department for Education outlined how they were going to respond to this. So the Ministry of Justice specifically said they would use Environment Agency and Met Office expertise to update its CCRA to reflect greater detail on risk posed by overheating and flooding in prisons. And the Department for Education will publish an annual risk assessment for flooding, overheating and water scarcity to inform decisions on how education settings are then to adapt. So just to summarise the kind of needs that the government have around, particularly heat stress in buildings. So they want to respond to the CCRA and NAP processes, particularly quantifying current and plausible future climate risk associated with high temperature in schools and prisons. And the aim is ideally to kind of prioritise which locations and which buildings are most at risk of overheating and therefore most urgently need to adapt. Then to provide information to support decisions around how to invest and how to kind of adapt to climate change. And in the example of the Department for Education, actually help inform school level climate action plans. So just an overview of kind of what we've done into kind of response to this to help support this and help inform government policy. So as I've described in the first part of the talk, we developed this novel spatial risk assessment framework. We then went on to work directly with the Department for Education and University College London, who've been developing some really interesting school building models to apply this approach to explore current and future overheating risk in schools in England. And we then extended this work to implement kind of higher resolution climate projections, more detailed school building model data, and also look at additional risks, not just whether the school overheats, that's when temperature exceeds some kind of threshold, but also how just moderately high temperatures may impact loss of learning. And the Department for Education published a kind of high-level summary of this work back in June as part of their NAP 3 commitments. We've also worked with the Ministry of Justice and Oxford Brookes University to apply this approach to explore current and future overheating risk in prisons in the UK. And in the context of schools, we've been working with school leaders and city councils, attending workshops to help support the development of on-the-ground school climate action plans. So to really try and understand and communicate how the risk assessment work that we've done can help to inform those plans of what to do to adapt in the future, and also kind of gather those lived experiences from people that are actually being affected by overheating in schools. And then in future work, as part of a new programme called Maximising UK Adaptation to Climate Change, or MAC. This is kind of a current research programme that's follow-on from the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So under this, I'll be working on extending the framework to explore climate adaptation decision-making under uncertainty, which is building on some work that we've been doing with researchers at the University of Bristol. And hopefully, if anyone wants any of these links, then I'm happy to share the slides. Please do let me know. So just to go into a bit more detail about how we actually applied this risk assessment to this framework that we developed to assess overheating in schools. So in this case, this is particularly the paper that we did here, rather than extending it to the kind of higher resolution data. So in this case, we were just looking at the overheating risk. So the risk here is the expected number of days each school overheats in a school year, where here a school year is considered to be 195 days because of weekends and holidays. And overheating is when the indoor maximum daily temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius. So a pretty high, hot, unbearable temperature. So in terms of the hazard, to be able to use our climate projections to represent the hazard and look at how this risk is changing in the future, we need the hazard to be something that we can extract from the projections. So we don't have indoor temperature from the projections, so we need to use just outdoor temperature. And in this case, we use daily mean temperature. And in this particular application, we use the regional climate model data with the 12 ensemble members and the same 3 global warming levels as in the idealized example. But in this case, we leave out August because that's obviously when the summer holidays are for schools. So we don't want to kind of capture the overheating during those periods. So then the exposure is the location and characteristics of schools, so that we understand which schools are more likely to overheat. We need to know about them. So we have the locations of schools. There's about 20,000 schools in this assessment. And each of those is characterized into one of 130 archetypes, so type of school, based on what region the school's in, whether it's primary or secondary, and then the era of the building, so whether it's sort of Victorian or modern, for example. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a couple of slides' time. And then the vulnerability is then a function that maps the hazard, so the outdoor temperature, to whether the school overheats indoors. So for this, we require, first of all, a function that estimates the daily maximum indoor temperature during occupied classroom hours from daily mean temperature outside. And for this, we had very helpfully identified some digital twin building models that UCL had been developing for schools. And so we're able to take these digital twin models and take the data that relates outdoor and indoor temperature to build that information about that relationship. And we have a different function for each of the school archetypes. So just for a bit more information, as I said, the hazard came from the UK climate projections. And here we just have a map of one event, one day from those projections in terms of daily mean temperature. And in this paper, we actually provide a bit of a comparison to an approach that's quite commonly used in assessing overheating risk in buildings. So often in these kinds of studies, they use really impressive detailed building models, but often quite a simplistic characterization of the weather or the climate. So these things called weather files. So what they do is basically take a single kind of time series of weather to represent each region of these sort of 13 regions seen here in this map. So it's a kind of non-spatially coherent time series of weather, which they kind of apply to any building within that region. And so we want to just provide this comparison to see what's the impact of using this non-spatial information compared to this kind of fully spatially varying hazard information that we can use within the spatial risk framework. So then the exposure information, as I said, is the location and the archetypes of the different schools. So these archetypes are characterized by whether the school is primary or secondary, what era the school is built in. So this is shown by the different colors of these different points in these plots, and then which region the school is in as well. And so each of these 20,000 schools we can see in these maps are allocated to one of those 130 archetypes. Then the vulnerability function, as I said previously, maps that outdoor temperature to whether the school archetype overheats. So here's just some example data for one of those archetypes in the Thames Valley region for a particular kind of era of the building and primary. And so the blue points here are the outdoor daily mean temperature, and the red points are indoor daily maximum temperature, and that's shown for a year of data or against day of the year. And we can plot that instead as a kind of scatter plot where we can see the outdoor temperature on the x-axis and indoor on the y. And so this gives us a mapping between the two. So we fit a simple linear regression to these points, and this gives us a way of estimating indoor daily maximum temperature from outdoor daily mean temperature. So for example, when outdoor daily mean temperature is 20 degrees, that gives us a kind of indoor daily maximum temperature of about 33 degrees. And that allows us to kind of map between the two. And so then this allows us to then produce a kind of impact or vulnerability function that says there's no impact as long as the outdoor temperature is below the threshold that causes indoor temperatures to exceed 35 degrees. And then once that threshold is exceeded, then the impact is 1, and that school is overheated on that day. And that's shown here for that 35 degrees indoor temperature threshold here in blue. So, and then we have a different vulnerability function for each school archetype. And so then this is all combined together to kind of count up essentially the number of times over our hazard time slices that the school overheats. And then we can come up with risk metrics such as this one. So this is the expected number of days in a school year when indoor temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius. And this is particularly shown for the global warming level of 4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial. So quite an extreme future, but still plausible by 2100. And each point here is a different school. And we can see that this sort of risk metric, this is sort of the average number of days that this might happen at this warming level, goes up to about 25 days. So, you know, up to maybe even 5 weeks of school where we're seeing this extreme temperature indoors. And hopefully we'll never see this warming level, and hopefully we adapt and this never happens. But this helps to kind of give an understanding and of the kind of the level of risk that may be incurred. There's a number of caveats to this, obviously, by characterizing schools as archetypes, and we want to explore different climate model data and different scenarios, but this is just sort of an indication of that level of risk. So then just to talk about that kind of importance of spatial coherence in the data. So this is the same results just without the kind of fancy background. And what we did was explored what would happen if we prioritize schools based on this risk metric. So we said that the top 10% of schools was a high risk school, then the next 10% were medium, and then the bottom 80% were like low risk. And this is the map that we get in terms of prioritization of schools based on that risk metric. Then if we use the kind of regional location hazard information, where we just take whether the climate data from the middle of each of these regions where these black crosses are to represent all of the locations in that region, then we get quite a different picture in terms of prioritization. So it's much patchier, like we basically get the same risk for each archetype, and so we get a much different, much more kind of patchy picture in terms of prioritization. And in particular, we miss this sort of high risk patch around London. And so this really highlights how it is important to have that spatially coherent hazard information when we're wanting to prioritize assets across a range of locations. And again, we've got a paper on this if you're interested to read more. So then we extended this to look at higher resolution climate projections. So we use the same Climata framework, but now we integrate that with these higher resolution climate projections, the 2.2 local projections. And UCL then used some more detailed school building model information to then produce these 1-by-1 school building simulations. So rather than quantifying each school in terms of these archetypes, we actually they model each one individually, and then we produced a different vulnerability function for each school over England. And so then we can produce updated results for this. So this is the same sort of map of the expected number of school days that experience overheating or internal temperature exceeds 35 degrees. And with this enhanced data, we're actually getting kind of higher numbers potentially in that 4-degree scenario. So this is sort of some refined data that we're able to produce for them. And as I said, the Department for Education have published a high-level kind of summary of this, along with some other risk assessments that they've done on flooding and water scarcity back in June. And they provide a really nice quote about how this work continues to have a significant impact within the Department for Education, and it's helped to advance their understanding of this area, which is outside of kind of Department for Education's core remit. And they intend to include this work as part of their published climate risk assessment, and their ultimate goal is to use this to help inform decision making within the department, and hopefully continue to work together to improve the impact and policy and public good. So it's really great to hear how we're having this positive impact on the kind of decision making and their preparedness for climate change at the Department for Education. And then just to compare then this to the work that we've done for the Ministry of Justice. So we've used the same CLIMADA framework, the same hazard information, the high resolution climate projections, but now to assess overheating risk in prisons. And so now the exposure is around these prisons. So we have the location of about 124 prisons, each of which is allocated to one of 6 archetypes. Based on the period in which the prison was built and the setting of that prison. And then the vulnerability, in a similar way, rather than using building models, we actually used sensor data. So Oxford Brookes collected some temperature sensor data, both indoors and outdoors, in cells and non-cell rooms within the building. And we used that to model that indoor-outdoor relationship in a similar way to the schools, and therefore be able to assess when the prison cells and other rooms were overheating. And again, we're able to produce maps of those results, but we've also produced some kind of, here I've just showing the distribution of that risk metric, the expected total number of days where temperature inside a cell exceeds 26 degrees in prison archetype 1. And we can see this for the different warming levels, where this black dash line is the kind of observed, based on observed weather data in the current climate. And so we can see this is, already around 50 days per year in the current climate, and potentially growing to up to sort of 120 days in the future if we see the 4-degree warming level. And then for the Ministry of Justice as well, we've produced these outputs on a GIS format, so they can kind of interact with the data and overlay it with any other GIS information they have. And we're looking into doing that for the Department for Education as well. And again, they provide us with a nice quote about how this is informing their next climate change risk assessment, and will support future strategy planning and long-term estate planning, and then business cases for future investment. So again, really nice to see how this is having a nice impact in government. Then just very quickly to talk about future work. As I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping to explore adaptation under uncertainty. So we have all this risk information, but what does that actually mean, and how do we take that forward and make decisions about how to reduce risk and adapt to climate change? So initially, I'm going to be exploring this using school building simulation data. So I have some data for before and after 4 different structural improvement measures. So this is data taken from a UCL study, and that these are the 4 kind of structural improvement measures that are aimed at reducing the impact of overheating. And what you can do is use the kind of before and after to quantify how this changes that indoor-outdoor temperature relationship, and therefore the resulting risk. So here, this was the original sort of indoor-outdoor relationship for one of the archetypes, and you might expect that implementing some kind of improvement measure may kind of reduce the gradient of that relationship. So you need a higher outdoor temperature to incur overheating indoors. And then it might be that actually measure 2 is even more effective. So I haven't actually plotted these, but hopefully this is the kind of thing that we see happen. And then we'll do some kind of cost-benefit decision analysis to try and understand what's the kind of most effective approaches for adapting school buildings. And then I really want to explore uncertainty and sensitivity, as I touched on with the risk assessment framework. There's so many different uncertainties and decisions you have to make in terms of what data you're going to use, which forms of information you're going to use. So I really want to explore more of that as well. And then also, as a kind of extension of this, explore alternative adaptation measures, alternative applications to different stakeholders, exploring things like dynamic decision making and how you make decisions that evolve over time, explore maybe decision gaming and how we elicit kind of the needs from experts, and then thinking about things like cascading and compound risk as well, and how these risks don't happen in isolation and they're often compounded by other things that happen as well in a kind of system. So yeah, this will also build on this research that we're doing with the University of Bristol, where we have been doing a little bit under that idealized example of physical outdoor work. We've been exploring a bit of this kind of robust decision making under uncertainty and sensitivity analysis. So yeah, there's a paper out on that if you're interested to hear a bit more about or read a bit more about that topic. So in summary, we've developed an approach for integrating ukcp with spatial risk frameworks to assess future climate risk in a spatially consistent way. We've applied this approach to assess overheating risk in schools and prisons. We've demonstrated the impact the work has had in informing government policy on climate resilience and how it's supporting them in their CCRA and NAP processes. And there's a number of limitations, caveats, extensions that we can explore, things around adaptation decision making, applying to alternative risks and stakeholders, and extending to more complex compound kind of situations as well. Thank you very much for listening. Do you have any questions? And there's my email address if you'd like me to send you the slides or have an offline discussion. Thank you.
Laura, thank you very much for that. It was a great deal to take in. Just for chair's prerogative, while we wait for some questions, and please do ask any. There's the propeller diagram, as I call it, on slide 7, the risk framework. Each of those propellers changes over time. Or changes depending on the rate of climate change in terms of the hazard, exposure factors will change and the vulnerability will change. So it may be with the case of prisons, that prisons have become more vulnerable because of health issues, etc. As time develops, or the wear and tear of the buildings deteriorates if the maintenance isn't kept up. So how do you think you'll be able to incorporate those dynamic changes in this framework?
I suppose currently we kind of do snapshots in time. So we've used those 3 sort of warming levels. So we have explored how the hazard may change. In terms of exposure and vulnerability, in that idealized example, we were trying to capture how the exposure might change using those socioeconomic pathways. But yes, in the prisons and schools examples, we haven't actually changed, we don't change the exposure and vulnerability over time. I think that would be extremely interesting to explore, particularly when we translate the risk to schools into like loss of learning, then you've got kind of changes in the dynamic of the population that may impact things. So yeah, I think it could be built in terms of having some way of estimating how that might change over time, and you can literally swap in and out data based on what that might look like in the future. But it's really uncertain, isn't it? So it's something that you'd want to explore. What if you assume this? What if you assume that? And gathering that kind of data is always challenging, particularly around how the vulnerability changes.
Yeah.
Even just capturing the vulnerability in the first place is really tricky, let alone how it will change. But yeah, no, good point.
And apologies, we did have questions, but my Q&A button didn't let me know. So first one from Susanna Lincoln at CFAS, that's the Centre for Ecology, Fisheries and Agricultural Science, if I remember correctly. Can this spatial risk assessment tool be used with other climate hazards, such as sea level rise, if we think of coastal flooding and erosion, or even storminess? Or is the tool limited by the level of uncertainty associated with those hazards?
I haven't explored sea level specifically, but I don't see why it couldn't do. I think it definitely has the Climata is what I've worked with most, and there's inbuilt functionality and examples around particularly like tropical cyclones, windstorms, flood, anything the limitation is around the data that you have. So it has the kind of mechanics there that if you have information about hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, it can combine them together. But if you're missing any of that information, then it doesn't just have something inbuilt that it can kind of make it up for you. But the calculations are pretty quick, so you could say, well, what if we said that it was this, and what if we said it was that, and you can try and run some different potential exposures or vulnerabilities to explore that sensitivity. But yeah, I see no reason why I couldn't do coastal or winds type things.
And question from Becky Parish. Really, really exciting work and great presentation. Are you working with hospitals or wider health services, but health service buildings and infra?
Not currently, but I can see that this would be a really really good future case study application. So I recently presented at a government estates, like climate ready estates meeting, where I think there were some people from sort of the health services there. So yeah, I'm hoping to link up with them. I mean, if you have any contacts or anything, then very much keen to get in touch for sure.
And there is another question from Susanna Link at CFAS, but she's already had one, so I'm going to have to skip her. But it's worth reading. We don't have time to carry that on. Mm-hmm. From Leila Gohar, thanks for a great talk. How confident are you being able to provide guidance, for example, on changing timing of exams, given the impact of heat for schools based upon this work? And specifically, when this work do you feel needs more research?
It's a good question. I think there needs to be an additional piece of work if we're going to specifically think about exams and timings of exams. And I think that is an area that people are working on to understand the impact of temperature on exam results. But if we could construct a kind of way of measuring that, then we could kind of put that into the framework, and you could test out what if, like what's the loss of learning in June versus loss of learning if you did that in May versus April, and you could kind of compare that. I think you kind of shift your peak exposure, basically part of it. But I think that particularly would need more work. So it's always around that kind of vulnerability piece, I think, that's really hard, capturing the impact that temperature has. Someone needs to have kind of recorded that information somewhere for us to really reliably understand it. So I think that's where we need more research.
Did you look at anything to do with the real world data of, say, 2022, when we had it was 40 Celsius outside, let alone inside? And we know that once the internal temperature gets to 40 degrees, that's when individuals start having trouble cooling. So did you look at the impact of that year in particular on how this framework performs?
I didn't actually, no. That's a good suggestion, to see if that is one of the peak years, because I know that in the building overheating community, that year is often used as the like case study year of like this is really bad. We need to understand this year.
Okay, and final question. I'm pleased we will catch up on the ones that we haven't been able to answer. This is from Anubhav Chowdhury. Laura, amazing piece of work. Looking ahead, let's say a decade, as building research and high resolution climate modelling advance, where do you expect the greatest shift in sensitivity or uncertainty in your results? Is it on the hazard side, the vulnerability, or the exposure? And how much do you think that may change? That's a good question. If we all had a crystal ball or a climate model.
question. I mean, hazard exposure vulnerability, probably around the vulnerability, as we've been saying. It as this sort of climate adaptation, climate risk topic is sort of rising on the agenda, particularly in government. People are starting to kind of record this stuff more and understand that like data is the key to improving our understanding of risk. So I think probably the vulnerability, and how we can actually map the hazard to the impact is where we'll probably see the most change. But actually, what was quite interesting in that final paper I highlighted from the University of Bristol was that often the sensitivity of the decision is very much more related to kind of the uncertainty and the financial factors around the decision. So it kind of dwarfs all of that uncertainty and the hazard exposure vulnerability if you don't actually know the cost of some kind of adaptation measure to implement. And that's quite an interesting thing to explore. And I like obviously the financial change over the last sort of decade has been quite extreme. So yeah, I think maybe even the financial side will be the most sensitive.
Yeah, we can be fairly confident of the changes in climate. The modelling, is getting higher and higher resolution. It picks up more on some of the extremes, but the general direction is been uniform over the last 30 years since I've been involved in this. That the exposure side was.
David and Laura, I think we have Penny. We have a bit more time, and we have Penny Trenton wanting to ask a question. So if we can, I will unmute her so that she can make her question. Yes, I think is that okay?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Penny, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
Thank you very much indeed. My apologies. I must have hit a button accidentally, and I didn't mean to raise my hand to ask a question. Apologies.
Do you want to ask while you're on the line now? You've got the floor. Okay, you've got.
Shall we go through the other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just see. We'll start with going back in reverse now. Simon Hawkins. Had this been applied to other buildings and infrastructures which house infrastructure, i.e. mechanical, electrical instrumentation and control equipment?
Interesting. I mean, there's definitely application of similar sorts of studies to different types of buildings, but they're in that kind of way that I was describing with the weather files. So they develop these building models, and then they because they're quite complicated, it's really challenging to run like 100 years of climate projections through them. So they use these weather files. So I hope that the kind of analysis that we do here can kind of help to complement some of that, and give a bigger picture of the kind of uncertainty and the variability and the hazard part of it. So there have been similar studies applied to different house infrastructures, but I haven't come across anything specifically on this sort of equipment that you're talking about, no. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been. I just haven't.
I think there has been quite a bit of work done on sort of, in a non-expert cabinets, i.e. boxes on the side of buildings and on the side of roads and rail track, etc. Whether that's been well written up or not, I couldn't quite let you know at the moment. But I've been involved in risk assessments which have looked at this, but not in very, not in a comprehensive, systematic way about how bits of tech inside a cabinet will behave if one gets too hot, etc. Becky Parish, I think this is probably the final one. Becky Parish, who said, has any of this modelling been supplemented with surveys, interviews of the impacts, etc., for ground truthing the findings and hammering home the impacts and opportunities?
Yes. So not specifically our work, but we have been working with particularly Portsmouth local city council on our map. They were kind of a hotspot in terms of overheating in schools, which they saw that and got in touch with us because they were kind of like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And through that, we were involved in a workshop with school leaders in the Portsmouth city area, where there was researchers from the University of York who've been doing some of this. So they've sent out surveys and interviewed a number of schools, and understanding their perception of heat risk and their understanding in terms of kind of adaptation and that kind of thing. And we're kind of continuing to work with them to develop a kind of next phase where they'll be going into some schools in Portsmouth and actually gathering more of this insight and helping them to put together bespoke kind of climate action plans around overheating in schools. So yeah, really interesting to see how that evolves.
Okay, look, we'll call that a day here. So everyone who asked questions, thank you very much. And those who haven't had a chance to get them answered, we'll follow those up, hopefully. There's Laura's email address there for any further correspondence about papers, etc. As mentioned, the presentation will be put on the Met Office YouTube channel, or a subset of that, so it'll be available on there as well. Have we got another slide, Sitlali, for next one? There we go. Next webinar, 20th of November. Lisa Constable and Matthew Lawrence from Network Rail, adapting to a changing climate and how UK climate programme helps build a railway fit for the future. Let's hope it's worked all right today for those travelling by train. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. And Laura, once again, thank you very much. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.